Welcome back. We're still talking about the tomato value chain standards and the codes of practice to be introduced by the Standards Organization of Nigeria. Now, the country has the largest area harvested for fresh tomatoes in Africa with 541,800 hectares, followed by Egypt with 214,016 hectares as at 2014. However, research has shown that 40 to 50% of tomatoes produced in the largest African economy is lost. And that's due to poor handling, processing, and the preservation practices. But will the codes of practices being put in place by the Standards Organization of Nigeria be sufficient to address these lapses? Let's join the Chief Executive of Tomato Jos, Mira Mehta, who joins us from New York via Skype for this conversation. Good morning, Mira. Thanks for joining us on Business Morning. Well, let's start by taking you down memory lane. In 2015, when Nigeria experienced the tuta absoluta, commonly known as tomato Ebola, give us a sense of some of the actions that have been taken by farmers like you since then to prevent such occurrences.
Well, first of all, good morning. It's a pleasure to be on the show. You know, in 2015, as you rightly said, there was a major pest problem that swept across not just Nigeria, but all of West Africa. And, you know, one thing that Tomato Jos did that we implemented both on our own commercial farm and with our farmers was to really try and use the appropriate type of chemical pesticide that would attack that specific insect. You know, we've seen a lot of challenges with farmers not knowing what's available and farmers not knowing what to use for specific diseases. And this was an issue very much of that case. So, you know, a lot of it really is about education and then about making those products that will work available.
Now, having been growing and selling tomatoes in Nigeria technically since 2014, now, what are some of the challenges that you have had to face?
So post-harvest loss has been certainly a challenge. I know that's one of the challenges that SON is trying to address with their new standard. To give you an example, even this season during the coronavirus shutdown, that took place during the peak of our harvest season and during the peak of our farmers' harvest. And we had a really hard time getting fruits from Kaduna, where our farms are located and where our farmers are located, down to the major markets in Lagos and Port Harcourt. You know, a lot of the challenges, and I think that, you know, these challenges will remain regardless of what standard is in place, is that tomatoes are highly perishable. They may be in great shape when they leave the farm gate and they may be certifiable at that stage, but by the time they get down to the market, you know, it could be anywhere from 20 to 30 hours on the road. Those tomatoes will deteriorate, and you know that's a reality that we have to face in terms of, you know, just what it takes to do transport in Nigeria or in any country.
In a bit to ease some of these challenges now, the Standards Organization of Nigeria is developing some codes of practices and standards to actualize a valuable tomato value chain market. Are you actually aware of the standards?
Yes, I am. I have to commend SON. They did a lot to involve a broad base of participants in the standards creation. They did include technical and private sector members in their technical committee. So Tomato Jos was, in fact, involved in reviewing those standards once they had been drafted.
What does this mean for foreign investors, especially those investors and farmers like you that came with the aim of putting an end to the importation of tomato paste in the country?
It's a great question. You know, SON was initially put in place to help regulate and make sure that imported products were coming in at a minimum level of safety for consumers in Nigeria. And I think that if we look at SON in that light, in terms of trying to protect the consumer, in terms of trying to educate the consumer, I think that, you know, including a standard on tomatoes is certainly appropriate and will certainly help consumers. As a processor, you know, tomatoes are one component part of the end product that we're trying to make, right, which is the value add tomato product for the domestic market. And in that regard, you know, for me as a processor, my concern is more around what is the standard required for my end product, not what is the standard required for my component products. And so, you know, in the SON standard, for example, a cracked tomato might not be acceptable by SON standards. Well, a cracked tomato is acceptable for a processing standard because it will go into a facility and it will come out as a clean, good product that can be consumed. So there are a few differences between what the requirements are for consumers versus what the requirements are for industrial use. And as long as we bear that in mind, I think that the effort has been, very, very well undertaken, and I do commend SONCAP for that.
Now, given your Western experience of tomato farming, what would be your expectations from these codes of practices of the SON?
I mean, my expectations would be pretty much what they've set out. There's a minimum safety standard. If you read the code, and I'm sure that the code is publicly available now that it's been published, really most of it is around the chemical content of the tomatoes. You don't want to have residue on the fruits. You want to make sure that anything that's going into a consumer's mouth is safe. They have some requirements around size. They have some requirements around grading. Those are all pretty, not to use the word too much, but those are all pretty standards.
Regulations, of course, often attract investments. Now, do you see government's initiatives like this encouraging more foreign investors into the cold chain logistics side of the business, for example?
Cold chain has been something that people talk about a lot. As a private sector person, my view is also skewed to the private sector, and I think much more about what consumers want than around what regulations will do or won't do for investors. And to me, what I think will drive the cold chain investments the most is whether or not you can prove that consumers are willing to pay the extra price for tomatoes or any fruits that have been put through a cold chain system. Because remember, the cold chain will increase the cost of that fruit. Now, there's supposed to be a commensurate savings because of less wastage. I think that for investors to really move in a major way in this space, they need to see that borne out. They need to see that the cost of investing in a cold chain is recouped by the increased amount of fruits that consumers buy. I think that whether you have regulations or not in this area, that test is still something that has to be done in order for investors to really move in this space.
And talking about post-harvest losses and food waste management of the value chain now, Rockefeller Foundation is already involved in this aspect. Do you think that there's a need for more of such initiatives, perhaps to get Nigeria off the importation of paste?
That's a great question. I really do commend the Rockefeller Foundation for, first of all, even highlighting and bringing this to the attention of so many people who might not have known that it was a problem. Post-harvest loss is a huge issue in Nigeria. Post-harvest handling of fruits and vegetables, post-harvest handling and storage, even of grains, can lead to huge amounts of deterioration, not just in perishable products like tomatoes, but even in rice or maize, other areas. So I think that, these initiatives are certainly always welcome. And I think that, strong collaboration to make whatever the investment is or whatever the initiative is work sustainably, in a market-driven solution, even after the donor, completes their work is really where and how I think those dollars can be most effectively spent.
But how much of compliance with the codes of practices do you see among the tomato growers locally?
So that's a great question. Local farmers, many of them don't have access to resources. They wouldn't even know, where SONCAP is or how to download or, request for the SON regulations and standards. And I think that, one of the things that is really important is education, not just of consumers, but education of the producers. We've seen that farmers are very receptive to adopting better practices, again, when it makes financial sense for them. So, at Tomato Joss, we're working right now with about 300 farmers, and we are helping them to understand why it's important to wear protective gear when you spray chemicals, why it's important not to spray chemicals within 2 weeks of when you're going to harvest. Things like that, they haven't necessarily been taught when they've been farming, and they've been farming for the past 20, 30 years. So there certainly is a component there that's important to consider, which is the education of small farmers and making sure that we're not excluding farmers from a market by imposing regulations that they cannot adhere to.
And still talking about not excluding the farmers now, what do you make of the fact that the standards will actually be translated into local languages for some of these farmers?
I think that's great. I mean, I think, I'm somebody who is very much for open communication and open information sharing. So I think any way that you can share the information with farmers is a plus.
CEO of Tomato Just, Mira Mehta, thanks for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Thanks so much for having me.